The United States has launched what it calls Operation Economic Outcast. What exactly is it? See, it is a major economic offensive designed to put maximum pressure on Iran. The objective is quite simple: squeeze Iran's economy so hard that Tehran is forced to make concessions at the negotiating table. We know that for years, the United States and Iran have been locked in a complicated dispute, which is obviously over Iran's nuclear program. Washington wants restrictions on Iran's nuclear activities, particularly its uranium enrichment and stockpiles. It wants that in no case must Iran possess nuclear weapons. Iran, on the other hand, wants to protect what it considers its sovereign right to develop nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. So that is a major pain point between the US and Iran. Then there are other issues on the table as well, like Iran's frozen assets abroad, regional security, and how can we forget the strategically important Strait of Hormuz. So many unresolved issues are there. That is why the negotiations have repeatedly reached a dead end. Talks have collapsed several times. No diplomatic breakthrough could be achieved in these many years. There was a good attempt with the JCPOA, but Trump ruined that too. And now Washington appears to be saying that if strikes couldn't achieve the goal, if strikes couldn't make Iran surrender, plus if diplomacy isn't producing enough pressure, then in that case, let us increase the economic pressure on Iran. This is what the new strategy all about. Operation Economic Outcast. The United States is trying to target Iranian economy by cutting off the entire network that helps Iran survive economically despite American sanctions, by plugging the leakages, destroying the secret sanctions evasion network that has helped Iran survive for years despite crippling Western sanctions. Iran, as we know, has used intermediaries, shipping networks, and other financial channels to continue selling oil and moving money despite sanctions. The US wants to break that. So the American strategy is now to find every leak and to plug every leak. This is what the so-called zero leakage strategy all about. Basically, the United States wants to map the entire network from the company selling the oil to the ship carrying it to the financial institution processing the payment, the entire network, and then strike at the very core of Iran's sanctions evasion game. One of the most powerful weapons in the American financial system that will help it achieve this goal is, we know, secondary sanctions. Understand it like this. Suppose an Indian, Chinese, Turkish, or European company does business with Iran. Then the US would say that you can do business with Iran or you can have access to the American financial system, but you cannot have both. Choose one, Iran or the US. The same good old either you are with us or against us threat. Now this creates a very difficult choice for countries. Why? Because the US dollar is deeply embedded in international trade and finance. So countries wouldn't want to go against the US. It is simply too strong as of now. Banks around the world use dollar-based financial infrastructure to settle transactions. We do not have a viable alternative ready at present. So if a foreign bank or company is threatened with losing access to that system, the consequences can be enormous. They wouldn't want to risk it by siding with Iran. And the US knows it very well. And that is why it is weaponizing its economic power. This is economic warfare. Countries are very well aware of the fact that the American sanctions can have an effect far beyond America's borders. America does not necessarily need to control every company in the world. It simply needs to make companies believe that violating American sanctions could be more expensive than doing business with Iran. That is how financial power becomes geopolitical power. That is America's game behind the new sanctions as well. Now, this new offensive is not focused on just one sector. There are several major targets. First is oil. Oil obviously is extremely important for Iran because it is one of the country's major sources of revenue. So Washington wants to disrupt the networks that allow Iranian oil to reach international buyers. Second is shipping. Iran has relied on complicated maritime networks, including shadow fleet, to move oil and other goods, all of that to avoid sanctions. So the United States now wants to target not just individual ships, but the wider logistics network supporting them. Third comes finance. See, selling oil is only useful if you can receive the money. So the US is also targeting financial channels, intermediaries, and companies that help move Iranian money internationally. Plus, there are other areas such as cryptocurrency, gold and precious metals, aviation, and technology transfers. The US wants to target all that. This is the US strategy. Because when traditional financial channels are blocked, countries often look for alternative ways to move money and obtain goods. For example, gold can be used to preserve value. Cryptocurrency, it can potentially provide another financial channel. Shell companies, they can hide the identity of the real buyer or seller. And technology transfers, they can help a sanctioned economy continue operating. So Washington's objective is far beyond simply stopping Iran from selling oil. It has a larger objective, which is to make it extremely difficult for Iran to turn its economic activity into usable money, to throttle revenue from all channels. This is Operation Economic Outcast. This is where the strategy becomes much more serious. Because we have seen that Iran is not entering this confrontation from a position of economic strength. The Iranian economy has already been under enormous pressure. Inflation has been a major problem. The Iranian rial has suffered significant pressure. Ordinary people have seen their purchasing power decline. When a currency loses value, imported goods become more expensive. That can create a vicious cycle. Prices rise. People lose purchasing power. Businesses face higher costs. Investments, they become more difficult. All this can cause the public frustration to increase. So the United States is essentially applying additional pressure to an economy that is already under stress. Do you get that? Trying to cripple Iran's economy. Trying to force Iran to surrender. From Washington's perspective, the logic is straightforward. If Iran's economy becomes sufficiently painful, Tehran may eventually calculate that reaching a deal with the United States is less costly than continuing the confrontation. In other words, economic pressure is supposed to create political pressure, something which US and Israeli military strikes couldn't achieve so far. Despite elimination of the leadership, Iran hasn't surrendered. It has somehow survived. Because Iran has a different calculation. It has lived under sanctions for decades. It has developed alternative trading networks and has learned how to operate under economic pressure. It has been receiving support from US adversaries Russia and China. Plus, there is another important factor: Iran's geography. Iran sits next to some of the world's most important energy routes. And right beside it lies the Strait of Hormuz, through which a huge amount of global energy trade passes. Almost 20%. That gives Iran strategic leverage. And Iran has used it to its advantage so far. It is a huge leverage. So a big danger here with the US strategy is that the more aggressively the US applies economic pressure, the greater the possibility that Iran looks for ways to respond. And in Iran's case, that response doesn't necessarily have to be economic, as it has mastered the art of asymmetric warfare. It is under no foundation to play by the rules. It could involve diplomacy, regional escalation, cyber activity, maritime pressure, or other forms of strategic retaliation. That is the threat. So friends, what we are witnessing here is much bigger than another round of sanctions. This is another attempt to weaponize the architecture of global finance. This is economic warfare. The United States is trying to use its influence over the dollar, banking networks, shipping, insurance, technology, and international commerce to increase the cost of doing business with Iran. Now the strategic question is, can economic pressure force Iran to change its behavior, or will it simply push Iran to build even more alternative economic and financial networks? Because if countries under sanctions increasingly start creating their own payment systems, trading networks, and financial channels, we would eventually see something much bigger. A world where the American financial system is still extremely powerful, but where countries get fed up and create more alternatives to it. Time will tell whether this happens, but one thing is clear, that behind the scenes, banks, currencies, ships, oil, technology, and financial networks are all becoming instruments of geopolitical power.